Hello there. I wanted to do another video on stop and search, but as it relates to Eastern Europeans, because sometimes their expectations of how policing works differs from the way it actually is. And so I've called this When Stop and Search Protocols Are Different in the UK than in Eastern Europe. It's a fictional story. I want to tell you a fictional story, one built from truths whispered in communities, spoken around dinner tables, and learned painfully, sometimes too late. It's a story of how culture shapes expectation and how expectation can shape fate. The story begins. His name was Marek. It's a fictitious name, of course. 38 years old, a carpenter from a quiet town in southern Poland. He moved to the UK for work like many do, seeking better wages, better chances, and maybe a better future. Back home, Marek had seen his fair share of drunk men stumbling out of bars. Sometimes he had been one. In Poland, being drunk and loud wasn't ideal, but it wasn't unusual. And when the police stepped in, it was almost the same routine. A firm hand on the shoulder, a stern warning, a guided walk home, or a waiting taxi. A night in the drunk tank if things went badly, but never dogs, never weapons, never the fierce teeth-baring growl of an animal trained to control. Back home, police dogs were for big things, border operations, dangerous criminals, major incidents, not drunken men with more stubbornness than sense. So when Marek left the pub one winter night in London, stumbling, swearing and waving his arms far too widely, he didn't recognise the danger he was walking into. He knew he was drunk, but he didn't know he was vulnerable. A patrol unit spotted him weaving along the pavement. He wasn't threatened by anything, but he was threatening to walk straight into oncoming traffic. A police van pulled up. An officer stepped out, ordering him to stand back to give space to calm down. But Marek, warm from alcohol and the colder from pride, waved her off. He didn't understand her tone. He didn't understand why her voice was raised. Where he came from, loud voices from policemen, anger, not danger. And then he saw the dog. At first he laughed, not because he thought it was funny, but because he thought it was impossible. A dog for a drunk man? Not in his world. Not in the rules he had grown up learning. The officer warned him again and again and again, but Marek heard none of it the way she intended. She thought she was giving him his final chance. He thought she was bluffing. Two different worlds, two different definitions of the same moment. And when he stepped forward, hands raised in a sloppy gesture, voice raised in a slurry protest, the dog moved, suddenly, violently, decisively. The scream that tore from his throat cut through the night like metal on stone. He looked down and saw the blood blooming through his jeans, dark and fast, flowing from a place he did not even know could be injured. In that single second, his world changed. All his assumptions collapsed. Everything he thought he knew about policing, everything he believed about what officers would or wouldn't do, crumbled under the weight of pain and fear. To understand Marek's shock, you have to understand the world he came from. In Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, in much of Eastern Europe, police often rely on verbal commands, on guiding motion, on physical positioning, on simply escorting someone away. It's not perfect, it's not always gentle, but dogs, they are not the first tool, not even close. Drunk men shouting in the street are nuisances, not threats. They're handled like community problems, not tactical incidents. So when someone from the comes to the UK, brings that expectation with them, and finds themselves in a system that uses force differently, more quickly, more decisively, more defensively, the cultural gap becomes a chasm. In that chasm, misunderstandings grow, miscommunications deepen, and sometimes, as with Marek, people get hurt. Why the misunderstanding happens? Well, different countries train their officers differently. In the UK, officers are taught that a drunk person can turn violent suddenly. Dogs are trained to control suspects quickly before harm escalates. Threats and commands must be taken seriously because hesitation can cost lives. Use of force is calibrated to perceive risk, not just behaviour. But in Eastern Europe, drunkenness is seen more as a social issue than a policing threat. Officers may rely on restraint, not animals. People grow up seeing the police intervene more physically, but less aggressively. There is no lived expectation that escalation can move from shouting to dog bites in seconds. So when someone from Eastern Europe hears an officer shouting, they don't hear danger. They hear frustration. They think they're shouting at me because I'm annoying them, not because I'm unsafe. They won't really use that dog. This is like home. I know how it goes. But they don't. Because the rules here are different. Because the stakes here are different. Because the style of policing here is different. The truth is, people don't respond to police based on what they see. They respond based on what they expect. A man from Romania may expect a warning. A woman from Latvia may expect a fine. A teenager from Lithuania may expect to be told off and sent home. A man from Poland may expect to be guided away with a steady arm. But none of them expect a dog. And when the consequences don't match the culture, when someone thinks the officer is exaggerating or bluffing, they may push boundaries they would never push if they knew the reality. Not because they're reckless, not because they're criminals, not because they're defiant, but because the frame of reference they grew up with doesn't match the frame of reference they're living now. And when those two frames clash, the result can be devastating. When Marek woke up in hospital, he felt the room spin slowly around him. He didn't remember every detail, just flashes: the dog, the cold pavement, the officer's voice, the pain. His first words weren't angry, they weren't defensive, they weren't apologetic, they were, "I didn't know she would actually do it." Not because he doubted the officer's authority, but because in his world, that threat was unimaginable. He didn't expect the worst because where he came from, the worst didn't happen over drunken shouting behaviour. He learned too late that in the UK, the threshold for perceived risk is different. And when officers feel they are at risk, their tools reflect that training. For officers, it's about understanding that alcohol often strips away judgment, and that many migrants simply do not have a lived experience of UK-style command compliance. This can help officers see that a person's belligerence may be rooted less in hostility and more in confusion, fear, or a mismatch in policing norms. This awareness doesn't replace safety tactics, but it can guide tone, spacing, and communication, especially when the individual getting closer is just someone whose behaviour is shaped by a very different understanding of what police escalation looks like. It's a reminder that people don't all understand commands the same way. They don't all know the rules. They don't all recognise danger when it's being shouted at them. For communities, it's a reminder we must educate newcomers about the realities of policing here, not to scare them, but to protect them. And for the public, it's a reminder every encounter between a person and an officer is shaped not just by law, but by culture, history, expectation, and fear. For migrant communities, it's a warning wrapped in compassion. The UK system is different, the consequences are different, the interpretations are different, and knowing that difference can save lives. Stop and search isn't just about crime, it's about communication, it's about understanding, it's about two worlds meeting on the same street and trying, sometimes failing, to understand each other quickly enough to avoid harm. And I hope that little story will help you if you know people from Eastern Europe, especially if they're known to get drunk and be on the street, to warn them of the dangers of what could happen if they're stopped by the police. And that's all for now.